So we are here in Chief Joe's office with Frank Webb, artist extraordinaire, who's been around for a few years, and as you've got all those letters behind your name, AWS and NWS, and so you're at Chief Joe's this week. You're kind of intimidating because you've been around for so long, and I really admire your work. And but you're still at it.
Well, it's added a lot of quality to my life. I think having a craft in the arts or any craft is good for the morale. I think quite often artists live to a ripe old age. You see maestros in music,
Right.
at old age, and it's, I think it's just good to have some emotional security based on the value of having developed an art or a craft.
Well, what keeps you going after all these years you started being an artist how many years ago?
Well,
1953 or?
when I was, I went to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh to study art as a GI, right, and I was discharged from the Navy in 1946.
Okay.
And I loved it. If somebody would have given me a salary to stay there, I'd still be there. Painting from life,
Yeah.
painting still life, painting portraits, and I love painting what I see. And over the years, I learned to augment that somewhat to paint not just what I see, but what I think and what I feel.
Okay.
That takes a long journey, I think, to develop bit by bit the amount of courage it takes to say what you think.
Right.
It doesn't take much courage to say what you see, but I think it does take some to say what you think or feel.
Right. So would you say you're telling a story in your paintings?
Telling a story, well, the story probably, if there is one, it's not a narrative in the sense that it relates to, my day-to-day life, except it's a story of appreciation.
Right.
Appreciation is shown in many ways in life, but I think to paint is to revel in the opportunity to show what life can be like.
Right.
When it's felt more deeply and seen more clearly. And I think the arts were invented for that reason.
Right. So you were in the advertising industry for a while?
Well, for 30 years, I eventually, up till 1980, I left the advertising business, but at that time I left it. I had a studio with several artists in the employee, and my biggest client was U.S. Steel.
Right.
So I walked away and never looked back and gave the studio, literally gave it to them, and it seemed like it worked out as a good time to leave it because that big account, the U.S. Steel, fell on hard times.
Right.
In the later 80s, and so I would have lost my biggest customer if I'd have stayed on. But I left primarily because I wanted to do more teaching and more painting and to become the artist I hoped to be when I was in art school. Commercial artwork is, there's a lot of scut work. It includes things like pasting columns of type down
Right.
and so forth.
Right.
All that stuff is passé now because
Right.
in the computer age,
Right.
those things are gone. But it was, I believe, at one time, the graphic arts industry was one of the 5th largest industry in the United States.
Right. So, along with Edgar Whitney, would you say that you have defined an area of watercolor?
Well, I think I probably have defined myself because, I'm finding out, I think that anyone who paints gets well acquainted with himself. I recognize my fears, I'm aware of my shortcomings, I don't necessarily see, if I have a style, I don't think any artist sees his or her style as well as others do.
Right.
But it certainly ought to be, over a lifetime of painting, a certain giving up breadth for the sake of depth.
Right.
And so having no problems of making a living in the fine arts, I thought at first, I think that the teaching was the answer for me, because I don't really sell enough paintings and I don't seek gallery affiliations. I've had some over the years, but they come and go,
Right.
the galleries. I think teaching keeps me in touch with people who are like-minded, in the sense that I'm trying to better myself, and the students also. Robert Henry, the famous art teacher, said, "In my office toward you, I'm trying to improve myself." Because teaching helps us to, I think, bring the most important truths more clearly before, without deviating into more superficial aims.
Right.
It keeps us into basics, I think.
So you're a big brush kind of guy. How would you describe your painting style?
Well, I like the idea of the big brush relates to my experience in illustration and advertising, because where time counts. We charge by the hour, typically, and if you can work with a big brush and do things a little faster and more directly. And here's another thing, I think marks made with the big flat brush have a certain emotional content
Right, right,
than built-up areas with a pointed brush can have.
right.
But working with a pointed brush is somewhat more akin to working in a coloring book. Although there are wonderful shapes can be made with a
Right.
pointed brush, and I use it to some extent. And lettering too. Lettering was a very important
Right.
introduction for me into the relationship of abstract shapes. And having to indicate lettering on layouts in the advertising field with chisel point pencil, and with new pastels with chisel points, I right from the beginning and right over all these years, it was a way of me building on the arch that already I had built,
Right.
adding to that arch of experience. And everybody, I think, has an arch of experience, and the trick is to find out what is there about my own history now that can help me
Right.
relate it to my painting. Because I think every painting is autobiographical. Every painting, in a sense, is a portrait of the person who painted it.
Right. So most of your paintings are sort of abstracted in a sense, right?
Well, I think so, and the reason for that is I abstract in the preliminary drawing, and then fit the academic drawing into it.
Right.
You can't do it the other way. You can't make, I don't think you can make a academic drawing of a subject and then expect to somehow abstract it. I've had friends who snap strings and chalk all over it, and then, fracture the surface and
Right.
go back. There are some, there's a million ways to paint, I guess.
Right.
And how you handle between the extremes of the abstract, the non-objective on the one hand,
Right.
and the Norman Rockwell on the other end, we've
Right.
got to find out where we belong somewhere on that. And I think there are values in both. And it may be, at least I think, that it's more demanding and challenging to try to have a kind of a semi-abstract, because I like recognizable subject matter.
Right, right.
At the same time, I want to be more than just the content. I want to have form, which is another word for design.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, because you talked about the passion and feeling the strokes of the brush almost as if you're a conductor and you're getting ready for that big finale, and rather than being so picky, so that's what you're looking for, an emotional kind of response to your stuff.
Well, I think so, Terry. I believe that you can't, I think I like to begin a painting very loosely and with big bodily gestures, because you can't loosen up. You can't start a painting in a tight manner and then loosen up.
Right.
You can start loose and then tighten to a degree, so the sequences are more possible. So I think risking wasting a paper up front by coming in with a slam bang kind of approach is eventually, I think, for me, is more fruitful. And it allows me to respond to the painting instead of to the subject, per se.
Right, right. One of the questions I always ask the instructors that I'm interviewing is, I've begun to realize the responsibility you have to your 20 or 25 students. So when you come in and when you start the beginning of the week, what do you want them to leave with? What do you want those people to get from you that they can take home?
I think the most common need to the people at that level, the people that come to workshops, and many of them need to be convinced to design before they paint.
Right.
Many of them don't draw much, and I think that I would encourage them to design and make their mistakes first in a preliminary drawing, and so when they come to the paper, then to paint on the watercolor paper, with each stroke, I want them to sort of know, what value am I trying to produce here? What shape am I trying to produce? How dark, how light? And so the drawing that is beside me is my teacher.
Right.
So I have a teacher beside me all my life when I work. I have a teacher. In advertising art, we always had what we called the layout.
Right.
It was done by, sometimes in the advertising agency, the layouts were made by art directors, they called themselves. It sounds more significant. And then eventually another artist is called in, usually a freelance or a studio artist, to do the finished
product, right. So your goal is to teach your students how to plan a composition and then fill it in and with depth and meaning and purpose and...
I think so. I think in the drawing it becomes the aesthetic embryo. Not to say that we're trying to lay an egg, but
Right.
but the drawing should be pretty much the concept, and allows us. Now here's the thing: if you love color,
Right.
if you love color, it's good to know the shape you're after and the value you're after. And well, let me put it another way. While I'm painting, doing the finished painting, while following somewhat my drawing, I can rely more intensely on and thinking about color.
Right, right.
Many people jump into color right away on a piece of paper. You know, it seems to be bypassing the idea of having some kind. The picture needs some kind of architecture.
Right, right, right. I can see how you have approached your painting style based on your early advertising design and that whole process that we used to have to go through. The initial layouts, and then you fill in a little detail, and then you get somebody to come in and do the big brush strokes and fill in all the color, and then present it to a client and say, this is who you are. So another question is, if you could be any artist in all of history, who would you be and who's been the most influential on you?
Well, I wouldn't trade with anyone, but if I had to, I like many of some of my favorites are from the California school, so to speak. George Post, Rex Brandt, Robert E. Wood. Those are the top three
Okay.
that I think I have been influenced by, and they have all also been teachers. And of course, my interest in painting goes beyond watercolor. I
Right.
don't do it too often these days, but I painted quite often in oil, and I used to do a lot of pastel portraits many years ago, and so for that reason, I don't ever refer to myself as a watercolorist. I'm not too fond of that word. I like to say painter.
Painter?
When I address my students, I like to say good morning, painters. The watercolorist sounds a little bit superficial or like a hobby of some kind. Not that there's anything wrong with a hobby. Many of the world's finest artists, were not professional. If you had to define professional as being able to make a living,
Right.
I think the word professional could be defined some other way than that. But it's a lifelong attempt to seek after quality while the world around you is all seeking quantity.
Right. That's good.
And of course, it seems to me more and more, the older I get, the more it seems to me that there are so many adults who have maybe reached retirement age and have the ways and means to become an artist to some extent that maybe they wanted to be when they were young,
Right.
but they had to make a living. And then, of course, at my age, many of us I was in the service twice, at the end of World War II, and then during the Korean War, I was recalled for 2 more years. But that's experience. Even that experience, though, is appreciated because I met a lot of wonderful people. No one ever shot at me while I was in the service, so I was happy not to be hit with the bullet. But on the other hand, I think I learned a great deal, traveled a great deal, went to many foreign countries.
So a very pointed question, what would I learn if I decided to take a Frank Webb workshop?
You'd learn to become Terry.
I'd learn to become Terry, okay?
Your job is to become you.
Right, right,
My job is to become me.
right.
And I don't think, I believe that no one ever went to their grave quite knowing how to paint.
Right.
We might think they do, but I imagine if you could bring them back, they would say they were still learning.
There's always that question, and I think, was it Picasso that said something about that he was trying to get back to the point where he was a child approaching the medium of art and always kind of reinventing himself. And you're right, I think most children know how to paint.
Well, I would make one caveat about that comment. I think that children know how to paint, but if you look at their paintings, everything is separate.
Right.
The house, the tree, the person, the sidewalk leading up to the house.
Yeah.
They don't know how to put it together.
Okay.
That's the adult thing.
Right.
See, the design is knowing how to create relationships among all the parts,
Okay.
how to provide linkage, how to provide overlaps,
Okay.
and that's the difference. Children's drawings are very creative. The little
Right.
kid, when asked, how do you do those things, he says, well, I think, and then I put a line around my think.
Right.
In the kindergarten one day, the teacher came across a child and working, and she said, how does this go now? You think I'm forgetting this story? Um, well, I'll tell you the one about the artist that's in the pasture instead, because I remember this one quite well. The artist was painting, and the little kid came across the pasture, and he was watching the artist for a while, and he said, "What is it supposed to be?" And the artist said, "It's supposed to be a horse." And the kid says, "Why isn't it?"
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting because I think as we grow, as we become adult, we don't think we can do certain things because we begin to compare ourselves with other people. And that's the death to art when you start comparing yourself to somebody that might be better, whatever, or somebody that might be worse. I mean, that's a biblical thing. Don't compare yourself to one another because...
Well, yeah, my teacher, Ed Whitney, used to say that one threat to your happiness is too much concern what other people think.
Right. That's good. That's good.
We have to be concerned about other people, of course, and we usually have a certain obligation toward family and friends and so on. But I think taking on the time to be an artist means that there are other things in life you may have to overlook.
Right, right.
I think a certain sacrifice has to be made. You're making a living is one thing, but when you come home, then there are other things that need to be done. Family needs, and friends, and you get to be my age, a lot of funerals to attend, and it's you realize that time is the stuff of life.
Right.
And there has to be a big investment in painting in order to reach a stage where you know that you know.
Right.
I was writing an introduction to a friend who's preparing a book on design, and included in my comments were one of the big problems I think nowadays with people who aspire to paint is, and regarding the importance of design. The sad thing is that they don't know that they don't know.
Right.
They believe that just drawing what you see is it. Well, it is the foundation. Everybody has to begin that way, I believe, learning how to paint what you see, but it has to get beyond that.
Right.
And that's the challenge. And you don't necessarily always have an audience like the actor has.
Right, right. Well, that's an interesting thought, getting beyond what you see. And that would probably be the definition of art. Rather than photorealism, which is trying to make something exactly the way you see it, you want to get beyond that. And I think that's when you bold brushstrokes and a little bit of abstraction get you to the point where you're creating that dynamic.
I think that's so, Terry. Yeah. I think that is so. It's the photorealism may have a built, you might say, a prepared audience because most people understand photos.
Right.
Although they say that Aborigines and other folks who have never seen photos don't know how to understand photos. They have to learn to do so. When I say they have a ready-made audience, they look at a painting and probably they can come to painting armed only what they've learned from looking at photographs.
Right.
And it's for them it's a way to identify, you might say, the quality of the painting.
So one of the last questions I always ask is, do you have a Cheap Joe's story to tell, or?
Well, I first met Cheap Joe, I think before he was Cheap Joe. He showed up at a Springmaid Beach workshop, I think the first year or second year they had that workshop series. And he said, "Frank," he said, "why don't you come down to Boone and do a workshop. And I said, well, what is exciting about Boone? He said, well, you can stand outside my drugstore and watch the traffic light change. I know, I've heard some of Joe's stories, and I always enjoy his appreciation of growing up in the mountains here. And where I live in western Pennsylvania, we don't have, well, the mountains are a little bit east of where we live. In
Right.
1 hour we can be in the mountains, but we have hills, and I like living among hills
Yeah,
and valleys. I don't understand folks who live in the flatland,
yeah,
whether it's Florida or Nebraska. I like to see things looking down sometimes and looking up sometimes, and not just left and right.
right. I had a friend who lived in Kansas, and after I moved to North Carolina in the mountains, we talked about the difference between Kansas and North Carolina mountains. And he said it's real easy to live in the mountains and appreciate everything. He said to live in the flatlands of Kansas, you have to really get deep to really appreciate it, you know. So there's some truth to that, I guess, that, you know.
Well, I think the Dutch painters dealt with that in their paintings. Their paintings are mostly skies,
Yeah,
because that's mostly what they see.
that's what they say, right. Yeah, there's really no landscape, right, so. Well, Frank, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm sure you want to get back to your class, and I'm sure you have many more years to paint and create and teach.
Well, thanks, Terry. I appreciate the opportunity to exchange thoughts with
Yeah.
you, and best wishes to you and your painting and your association with Chief Joe's
Well, thank you.
business here. Everybody in the United States that paints probably knows about Chief Joe's.
Well, we hope anyway, right? So,